Okay, guys, so this lecture is going to cover photosynthesis. The source of all energy on Earth comes from the sun. That energy is then going to be converted via photosynthesis by plants and algae and photosynthetic things that are green, into usable energy that life on Earth can then use. The energy that's coming from the sun is not usable energy. That energy cannot be used by any life on Earth. It is then captured by the chloroplast in the plants, which is what we'll go over in this lecture, and then converted into a usable form of energy, ATP or glucose, that the plant can then use to do physical work. So we convert energy from the sun into physical energy, chemical energy inside of the plant that can be used by the plant to do things. And then we can eat the plant and get the energy from the plant, and so on and so forth. So plants can't just make food out of nothing. They have to have a couple of raw ingredients, and that makes sense. You have to have sunlight, and sunlight is the fuel that powers photosynthesis. This is the gasoline, if you like, the energy to power the reactions of photosynthesis is going to come from the sun. The energy to power our reactions to make energy inside of our cells comes from the food we eat. These guys get the energy instead of eating food, they get it from the sun. You need carbon dioxide. This is your source of carbon. And they're going to take carbon dioxide and strip off the carbon and use that to make glucose. And the oxygen is going to be released for us to breathe. And then water. And they're going to use water to strip off some of the electrons and things like that as well. And so these three things right here you're going to need for every single plant on the earth to carry out photosynthesis. And we'll talk about what happens with each of these things in just a little bit. So let's talk about how photosynthesis forms and kind of the products that go in and the products that go out. So plants are going to take simple things, carbon dioxide that I mentioned earlier, water, and energy from the sun, sunlight. And they're going to take that combination of things and they're going to convert it inside of their cells. And then they're going to produce glucose, which is a form of simple sugar, and oxygen, which is what we're going to breathe. So the glucose they're going to use to power their cells, that will remain inside of the cells. The cells will use the energy inside of the glucose molecules to make ATP and so on and so forth. And then the oxygen will be released from their cells into the environment, and then we will breathe that in. So every single time energy is exchanged from the sunlight into plants, that energy sometimes loses a little bit of its energy in the form of heat. Now this is always going to occur, unfortunately. It takes energy to make energy. The same concept of it takes money to make money. Cells have to power the machinery to make photosynthesis. You have to power the machinery for our cells to make energy as well too. So every time the energy comes from the sun, it hits the plant gets maybe a tenth of the useful energy that's in that sunlight because it takes a little bit of it to power the plant to make photosynthesis, and most of it's going to be lost just as simple heat. It's going to hit the plant and float off into the environment. The energy will be lost as heat. But then every time you eat the energy that the plant makes, or another organism does, you have the same thing. You will release a lot of heat through the process of breaking down food, simply keeping your body powered. A lot of the energy that's available inside of that glucose is going to just be simply lost by your body as heat. About a tenth of that will be used to power things inside of your cells, doing things, keeping you happy, keeping you alive. And as a byproduct, you will release carbon dioxide and water from your carbon dioxide cellular respiration process, metabolism. That carbon dioxide we release and the water will then be reused by the plants to power their photosynthesis, which will then release more oxygen and glucose, which we will use to power us, which then so on and so forth. It's just a big old cycle. All life on Earth depends on photosynthesis to create the energy that powers life. The initial glucose comes from all the plants. No non-photosynthetic organism like this deer here can produce glucose from sunlight. They have to get it from other things that they eat. So without this plant to make the very first glucose, we wouldn't have it. And also, it's a big old cycle. Every life depends on it because without them, we would not have oxygen. It's our big deal here as well. So oxygen is the byproduct of photosynthesis, and without that oxygen, we would not be able to breathe. So the sun releases light. We all know that. You can see it. I mean, you've probably seen a breakdown of the wavelengths of light as well. Well, the wavelengths of light, the shorter the wavelength, now the wavelength refers to the little zigzaggy right here, how zigzaggy it is. If it's a short wavelength, it's got a very prominent zigzag in it. And if it's a low wavelength or a short wavelength, a long wavelength, excuse me, you can see here it's got a much gradual, kind of a very smooth sloping curve to it. Not very zigzaggy, not very wiggly. Short wavelength, long wavelength. The wavelength has to do with the distance between peak 1 and peak 2. Peak and peak, peak and peak. So if the distance is short between the two peaks, short wavelength. If it's long, it's a long wavelength. So that's what that refers to. Well, anyway, not every bit of light that that the sun releases can be used by plants to power photosynthesis, and not even all of it we can see. The light that can be used by photosynthesis covers the visible spectrum. Now, the visible spectrum ranges from about 750 to about 350 nanometers of light if you break that out. Now, in that wavelength of light, we can see those colors. We can't see ultraviolet radiation. You can't see X-rays. You can't see gamma rays. We can't see these things. These portions of light our eyes and retinas can pick up. Anyway, the shorter the wavelength, the more energy that's contained in it, and that makes sense. The more zigzags, the more energy that's in it. Not a lot of energy in a low zigzaggy wave. Short wavelengths have way more energy than long wavelengths. So only some of the wavelengths of all that light, like I mentioned, are going to reach Earth. Our atmosphere does a fantastic job of filtering out a lot of the ultraviolet radiation and some of that stuff that's bad for us. Is filtered out by the ozone layer. So what does reach Earth, like I mentioned, is going to be a couple of these things at different levels, but the visible spectrum of light is very easily passable through the atmosphere. So once again, like I mentioned, we perceive that visible light as colors. Now, plants, they have pigments inside of their bodies, inside of their cells, that are able to capture these wavelengths of light and transfer that wavelength of light from from kinetic energy from potential energy in this wavelength of light. That wavelength of light's not going to do anything if it touches you, but those plants have machinery to convert this energy in this wavelength of light into physical energy in the form of ATP. So they can take this energy in this light beam and use it to do physical work inside of their cells. That is where all life comes from, the ability to use wavelength energy in light to convert that to physical energy to do something inside of your cells. We cannot do this. Our cells cannot do this. Only photosynthetic organisms can. So being able to be photosynthetic means you can use light energy to convert carbon into food and sugars for yourself. Now, every different plant has different levels of pigments inside of them and different types of pigments. Chlorophyll A, chlorophyll B, carotenoids, xanthophylls, there's 5 or 6 more different types of pigments that are found in plants that capture light. Now, plants, as you saw, the wavelengths of light have lots of different colors inside of them. And if you're a plant, you want to have pigments that can capture lots of different colors and ranges of wavelengths of light. It doesn't make a lot of sense for you to be able to only capture just one wavelength of light when all the rest of these wavelengths of light carry energy. So plants have multiple different pigments that have evolved to capture different wavelengths of light and convert that energy into physical energy. Now you can see here a breakdown of the different chlorophyll A, the dark green line. It picks up red really well. You can see that over here, red, orange colors in that wavelength, and then kind of blue, purple. Those are the colors that are going to power photosynthesis really well. Those pigments, as you can see here, blue and green, or blue and violet, carry a lot of energy, and then red and orange, they're very low energy wavelengths, but they do carry a lot of energy that the plant can use. So low wavelengths and high wavelengths are going to power photosynthesis really well, but the high energy, the short wavelengths are going to power it much better than the low wavelengths. But if you see here in the middle, you can tell that by the peak, by the way. Higher peak for the blue-yellow, for the blue-purple, the high energy wavelengths, versus a little lower peak over here, how effective this is with the red-orange. You see here in the middle that there's a big giant fall off. There is no energy absorption of chemicals or light there at all. No light absorption. And that has to do with the fact that plants do not absorb green and yellow light. If you're familiar with how light works, the colors that are not absorbed, if you don't have a pigment that absorbs it, the light that's not absorbed is bounced off the surface and reflected. That reflected light is what you see. So plants do not absorb green or yellow light. They reflect that color light back. They don't have any pigments that can pick up yellow or green light, or yellow or green pigment energy. So that that wavelength of light is reflected back away from the plant and absorbed by your lights or your eyes, and perceived as green. So green light does not power photosynthesis. If you put a plant underneath a pure green light with like a filter on it or something, or green light bulb, it will die. It will not be able to use that green wavelength of light to power photosynthesis. And you can see here there's very little absorption of green light inside of plants. So let's go ahead and talk about where photosynthesis is formed and how it works, and what goes on inside of the plant. So the very first thing that we need to talk about is where photosynthesis occurs. And photosynthesis occurs inside of a chloroplast. And I showed you guys a chloroplast earlier, that big green cell, or that little cell with the two green blobs on it, the big cell in the middle. And I'll show you guys again in just a second. So chloroplasts are inside of leaves. Chloroplasts are going to be found inside of leaves, and that's where all of the things that are going to take place for photosynthesis are going to occur. But before we can talk about photosynthesis, we need to talk about how the plant is going to get carbon and water and oxygen, carbon dioxide in and water and oxygen out of its cell. Now, you might not know this, but plants' leaves and things have holes in them. They have little tiny holes called stomas, and a stoma, or stomata, the plural term. Stomatas work like little tiny gates. They can open and close with water pressure. It's kind of neither here nor there. And they can open and close to let more CO2 in if the plant needs more, or they can close if the plant doesn't need any CO2. And they can open and close to let oxygen out and let more water out. If it's hot outside, you could close your stomas and keep the water in. You don't want it to escape and evaporate out into the environment. So plant leaves have little pores all along their surface called stomata that allow gas exchange to occur with the environment. Further, you can bring in your carbon dioxide from the environment that you have to power photosynthesis, and you can get rid of the oxygen in the water that you make as a byproduct of powering photosynthesis. So inside of a leaf, you're going to have tons of things called mesophyll cells, middle tissue cells, cells in the middle of the tissue. There you go. So those mesophyll cells are going to contain tons of chloroplast inside of them, and this is a chloroplast right here. So this is a plant cell. You can see the chloroplast right here, the big green blobs. Inside of those chloroplasts is where photosynthesis is going to occur. All the mesophylls of this plant inside of that leaf, all the green parts of the plant, the chloroplast are what's going to make the plants green. If it's a brown part of the plant, like a plant trunk, like a tree trunk, there is no chlorophyll there. There are no chloroplasts, so it is not photosynthetic in that portion of the plant. That portion of the plant gets its energy from the photosynthetic parts. They have to feed the non-photosynthetic parts. So the leaves feed the trunk of the tree, kind of thing. So let's go ahead and talk about what happens inside of the chloroplast and the anatomy of the chloroplast. So a chloroplast is essentially a mitochondria inside of a plant. It works pretty much the exact same way. It's going to produce energy via the electron transport chain and a couple of other reactions. So each mesophyll cell is going to have a couple of chloroplasts inside of it, and this is the inside of a chloroplast. You're going to find a couple of stacks of things called thylakoids. Now these thylakoids are going to absorb the light energy from the sun. The light's going to come in and strike the chloroplast here, the energy. These thylakoids are stacked up inside of the chloroplast. You can see this here called granum, stacks of granum. Or stacks of thylakoids, excuse me. The little individual thylakoid is a little tiny membrane-bound pigment molecule, and all the little chlorophyll A's, chlorophyll B's, and all that stuff is going to be stuck on the surface of that thylakoid. All the thylakoids are going to be stacked on top of one another. You can see up here like a stack of quarters to form a granum. Individual thylakoids stacked on top of one another form a stack of thylakoids called a granum. Photosynthesis is going to occur on the surface of these thylakoids and on the inside of the thylakoid called the thylakoid space. So inside of the thylakoids, embedded inside of their cell membranes, You can see here the space here inside of the space, the little cell membrane, the thylakoid membrane, I should say. This is what you're looking at. So if you zoom in, this is what you see here. This is the little line right here. This is what you're seeing. Are the photosystems, the things that will actually convert the light energy itself into usable physical energy by the plant. So inside those little membranes all around the thylakoid are going to be proteins, structures, and things like that embedded inside of those membranes that are going to capture the energy from the sun and then convert it into useful energy by the plant. And those are called photosystems. Usually they come in this form of chlorophyll A, chlorophyll B, and things like that, different pigments that capture the light. So now let's go ahead and talk about how photosynthesis occurs. So photosynthesis occurs in two stages. You have the light reactions and the carbon reactions. So let's talk about the light reactions first. So the light reactions are going to occur inside of the thylakoids, and they require water and light. You have to have light from the energy from the sun. It's going to strike the thylakoids and power the thylakoids to actually function. Water will come in, the hydrogen will be removed from it, and the O2, the oxygen, will be released. And that's essentially the process of the light reactions. Now, once again, I'll post a video to show you guys how this works in actual animated view, and you can see these things kind of actually go move along inside of the cell. ATP and NADPH. ATP is going to be cellular energy, adenosine triphosphate, and NADPH are also going to be produced. That NADPH and the ATP will then be reused by the carbon reactions, the next set of reactions for photosynthesis. And then oxygen gas is going to be produced as a byproduct. So water and light come in, oxygen leaves, ATP and NADPH are going to be produced as well. So let's go ahead and zoom in on these thylakoids and see what's happening on the inside of those. So this is a little complicated reaction here. So essentially what's going to happen is the light is going to come in, light energy is going to come in, and it's going to strike the thylakoid space. This is the inside of the thylakoid space right here. This is the thylakoid membrane. And essentially what's going to happen is the photosystem, the light reactions, are going to take energy from the sun and spin it through the electron transport chain over here on the end, power up electrons, carry electron energy from electrons to electrons, pump hydrogen inside of the cell, outside of the cell to create a concentration gradient, which will eventually spin through ATP synthase, the electron transport chain, which forces ADP to have ATP, ADP to have a phosphate group added to it through the spiraling of the hydrogen down the ATP synthase molecule, spinning the energetic input to force the ADP to ATP to form a new bond to form ATP. This is a very, very complicated walkthrough, which I'll post a video to show you guys how this works in video terms. So it'll be a little easier to follow. So the first thing that's going to happen is photosystem 2 is going to take energy from the sun and convert that energy to the transfer that energy from the light into the reaction center of that photosynthesis molecule. Chlorophyll is going to take that energy from the light and hold it. Chlorophyll A in photosystem 1. It's going to eject 2 electrons. Those electrons are going to contain energy. That energy from those electrons can then be used to do something else. Water is then going to be split. H2O will then be split into O and 2 H's. To replace those electrons that were split off from the hydrogen earlier. Oxygen gas is going to be released as a byproduct, and the 2 hydrogen molecules will then continue on through the electron transport chain and then through photosystem 1. So the electrons, the hydrogen electrons that are stolen from water, are pumped outside of the thylakoid space into a higher concentration. They spiral into the ATP synthase molecule right here. Spiral down the ATP synthase and make a little bit of energy. Then they move into photosynthesis, photosystem 2. The exact same concept. Light energy comes in, strikes the reaction center, strips off the NADP, plus it reduces it to NADPH. That NADPH is then going to be sent into the dark reactions, or the Calvin cycle, which we'll talk about in just a second. The carbon reactions, lots of different names for those. So like I said, I'll post a video showing you guys how this stuff works, an actual physical walkthrough. So now that you've kind of got a little brief walkthrough of the light reactions, oxygen and water and light are required. Oxygen is released. ATP and NADPH are going to be produced in the crossfire of this as well. Let's talk about the carbon reactions now. So carbon reactions are going to produce lots of glucose, and this is essentially what we want from the plant. This is how the plant's going to power itself. So the carbon reactions, like I mentioned, produce carbohydrates, and they occur in the stroma of the chloroplast, not inside the thylakoids, in the stroma, the space inside the chloroplast. So these guys are going to take carbon dioxide, strip off all the carbons, release the oxygen. All those carbons are going to be used to make glucose. So these are also known as the Calvin cycle or the carbon cycle. So this is how this works. A very, very, very complicated process. Once again, I'll post a video to show you guys how this works in physical terms as well. So the very first step, enzyme 1 is rubisco. This is a very important rubisco. This is probably the most numerous enzyme on the planet. This allows photosynthesis to occur. Plants that have photosynthesis have large amounts of rubisco inside of them. So since plants are very common on the earth, lots of plants, photosynthesis is probably the most common reaction that occurs. Rubisco is the most numerous enzyme on the planet. So rubisco is going to take this carbon dioxide and stick it onto RUBP, which is fine. If you don't understand what that means, that's okay. Like I mentioned, I'll post a video to go over this. An unstable 6-carbon molecule is produced, which is right here. This unstable 6-carbon molecule really wants to fall apart. It's unstable. It's got a lot of energy inside of it. It wants to fall apart. Every time it falls apart, it can donate some of the energy inside of it to something else, and that's essentially what's going to happen. Really long step of reactions to strip apart this 6-carbon sugar into 2 3-carbon sugars. You have to take some energy to do that. You're going to convert PGA into PGAL. PGAL is going to be then converted to make glucose. Then you need to refresh your RUBP. You need to replace that. So you're going to take PGAL and a little bit of energy, which is going to be reusable to replace this RUBP, which can then be used to start the whole process over again. So it's a self-refreshing cycle. The whole point of this is to get glucose. Now, glucose can be used for lots of different things. You can tear apart glucose for energy, break it apart, and actually use the carbons inside of it to power your cell cycle. Or you can use it to build things. You can chain lots of glucoses together. These are simple polysaccharides. You can use polysaccharides like cellulose. This is a long chain of glucose. Very structurally supportive molecule, very long, very hard to digest for non-bacteria. Very long, very straight, very strong. So plants use cellulose as a structural support system inside of their cells. You're familiar with this if you've ever taken celery and stripped apart one of the little strings inside of it. You can also use carbohydrates in the form of energy storage. Like starch. This is a potato. Now potatoes grow underneath the ground. The plant's on the top, the little tuber's on the bottom, and this tuber is full of starch. If the environment goes bad, if the plant dies, if it doesn't have enough water or whatever, the plant itself can then start to eat the starches inside of the tuber. It can digest the tubers, and then that carbon inside of those starches can then be broken down and used to make ATP inside of the plant. So carbohydrates have lots of different functions inside of plants, structural or energy support, or making energy. Now different plants, different species of plants, different types of plants get their carbons from different ways, and this has to deal with how they're open, their stomata, and what time of day their reactions occur. Now these type of plants are referred to as C3, C4, and CAM, the different types of ways that plants get their carbon. Now it also has to do with where photosynthesis is going to take place inside of their cells. So inside of a C3 plant, every single carbon the mesophyll cells, the Calvin cycle, the carbon reaction, is going to take place in the same cell as photosynthesis. Very energy efficient. You do photosynthesis up here, light reactions, and then right in the exact same cell, you have the Calvin cycle. You don't have to move any of your products. Very energy cheap, very easy to do. Now C4 plants, on the other hand, they have the opposite problem of that. mesophyll cell here, where their photosystem 1 is going to occur, their light reactions. And then they have to pump all of their products into these bundle sheaths here for the Calvin cycle to take place. So there's 2 cells involved with a C4 plant to finish photosynthesis, whereas a C3 plant only has 1. So a little extra step involved with a C4 plant. Now you can see here, C3 plants, like I mentioned, all of their stuff occurs in 1 cell in the mesophyll cell. Carbon dioxide, all that stuff is going to be made in the front part of the cell and then moved right down into the Calvin cycle. Their stomas are going to be open during the day. Gas exchange is going to occur during the day just like it should. Oxygen exchange, water exchange during the day. C4 plants, they have 2 separate cells. Photosystem 1, the light reactions take place in a mesophyll cell. The products of that are NADPH and a little bit of ATP are then going to be transferred to a bundle sheath cell, a separate cell, to finish the Calvin cycle. C4 plants, things like corn, their stomatas are open during the day as well and close at night. We have a cam plant. Cam plants are weird. They have 1 single cell, their mesophyll cell, but they open and close their stomatas at night. And that makes sense if you think about it. If you live in the desert, it's really hot, not a lot of rain. If you open your stomatas during the day, all of the oxygen, or all the water, all of the moisture that you're trying so desperately to preserve in the desert can evaporate out through those open stomatas into the environment through your cells. So that would be bad. So they keep their stomatas closed at night. They do their light reactions at night, and then during the day they open up their stomatas to get their carbon in and things like that. Very interesting cycle for these cam plants. They live in the desert. So most of these are found throughout the world, kind of anywhere you want to find them. Cam plants are kind of restricted to really dry, arid environments for the most part. So you can see down here some of the benefits and cost limitations of having those different types of plants inside of you, the different types of pathways. The vast majority of plants on the planet are C3 plants. C4 plants are corn and things like that. Some grains are C4 plants, and then cam plants, they don't make up many as well, and they're mostly restricted to the hot, dry desert environments. Sometimes non-photosynthetic organisms can become photosynthetic, and this is pretty neat. This is sea slug over here. It's a eukaryotic organism. He's not photosynthetic, but he does eat algae. And what he can do is he can go along in the environment and he can eat all these little algal cells, digest them, and steal their chloroplast. He can suck the chloroplast out of the little algal cell's body, and then he can embed it within his own body. Down here you can see he's totally green. So he's eaten tons of algae, and that algae's chloroplast can then make this sea slug photosynthetic. Now these chloroplasts don't live forever. They live a couple of weeks, and then they die, and this poor little sea slug has to go eat more algae and get his chloroplasts and steal those as well. These are called kleptoplastids, by the way. Klepto to mean steal, like kleptomania. So it's stolen plastids. They're not real plastids, but this guy can use them to power his life. He's got so many chloroplasts inside of him, they're making so much energy that he doesn't actually have to physically eat anymore. He has made himself photosynthetic by proxy. Pretty interesting little concept. And that's really all I've got for you guys over photosynthesis. Now remember, I'll be posting a couple of extra supplemental videos as well, so you guys can watch the process of photosynthesis occur in real time, or if you need a little bit of explanation, a little extra explanation or anything like that, it will be available for you. So that's all I got for you guys on this PowerPoint. On this lecture. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me. If not, have a good rest of the day.